Before the main part of the podcast, I would like to give a little shout out to the University of Hertfordshire, who are doing a doctoral study on something that is often overlooked in academia. They're conducting research into the experiences of parents or carers who help to look after a child or children where the family has a parent that has mental health difficulties. Now, that is a bit of a mouthful, but what they're looking for are people that are supporting a family where the parent or a parent has a mental health condition and you're supporting their child within the family. And this study is aiming to learn more about the experiences of parents and carers who look after a child or children in the family where the parent has a mental health difficulty. So, for example, this is if someone has a parent that has been living with bipolar or any other kind of mental health issue. So in this situation, what they're looking for are people such as the partner of the parent who is suffering from a mental health issue, the grandparents, older siblings, aunts and uncles, and so that's anyone that is really providing support to the child who is living with a parent that has a mental health issue. And these people will be often providing emotional support for the child. They may also help out with household chores and so forth. And these people are really important to the family and supporting the family generally. However, there's been a lack of research done on this area. So the guys at the University of Hertfordshire are looking for people who are looking after a child or children aged 4 to 17 with a parent that has a mental health difficulty. So this could be officially diagnosed or it could not be. So it doesn't really matter if it's diagnosed or not. Participants are expected or should be willing to take part in an interview with the researcher to talk about your experiences. And what will happen is that it will go into the larger study for the researchers to find out more about how your support is impacting the family and yourself. If you are willing to help out in this research, you will be asked to take part in an hour-long interview, and this interview and its location is generally flexible depending on your individual needs. And if you are nowhere near Hertfordshire, they can do the interview via Skype with you. So if there's anyone out there that's listening to this podcast and you think that you fit this criteria and you would like to find out more about how you can get involved with this research, all you need to do is send an email to r.bishop@hearts.ac.uk, or you can tweet at BeccaJBG. I will put all of this in the show notes for you so that if you are interested and would like to participate, you can easily find the information. I think that this piece of research will be invaluable to those that are looking after or helping out a family who has mental health issues ongoing, and you telling them your own personal experiences can help with them supporting other people who find themselves in the situation as well as yourself. So that was just a little bit of a shout out to this research study being conducted at the University of Hertfordshire by Becca. So good luck, Becca, in your recruitment of participants. Hello and welcome to the Mental Health Book Club podcast with your hosts Sydney Timmins and Becky Lawrence. We would like to take this opportunity to let you know that we will be covering a diverse range of mental health topics that may be distressing to some listeners. You can find a full list of the topics being covered in each episode in the show notes. Please check the show notes before listening to any of our episodes. Welcome to the Mental Health Book Club podcast with me, Sydney Timmins. And today we're going to be doing a deep dive into anxiety and autism as a result of the book that we read last time, which was Autism, Anxiety and Me by Emma Louise Bridge. But before we get stuck into the main content, there's just some general housekeeping that I'd like to discuss with you briefly. So these particular episodes, they're the ones that come in between the discussions that I have with Becky about different books, tend to be quite a lot of information, and I have had some comments from other people that they find that it may be a little bit too much. So I was thinking of perhaps producing a blog post as a result of each of these episodes with the notes that I create, so that if you did want to go back and have a look, then you can. So I will be doing that for this particular podcast episode and all subsequent episodes that are deep dives into a particular topic. The other important news is that I have created a Patreon page for the Mental Health Book Club podcast. And if you've never heard of Patreon before, it is a way that you are able to donate to the Mental Health Book Club podcast and other different podcasts and creative adventures out there to show your support with a monetary donation. And I've created 3 different levels, bronze, silver and gold. And you can pledge as much or as little as you like if you do wish to support the podcast with some cash. As a result of you guys donating to us, when we hit certain goals, we will be making donations to mental health charities, including Mind and the Mental Health Foundation. Depending on which level you subscribe to, if you choose to donate to us, you do get some benefits. So for the first tier, which is the bronze tier, you will get access to the Patreon-only feed, which will have an early release of the episodes that I record with Becky talking about books. We will also announce your name on the podcast in upcoming episodes as a contributor, and you will also be eligible for free giveaways. So the first lot of giveaways I have are for 5 different people. They are a bookmark and a Mental Health Foundation green pin, which is the ribbons that you see people wear for different issues. And so that will happen hopefully when we get some more followers. For the silver tier, which is a pledge of $5 a month, you will get all of the previously mentioned benefits, so the access to the Patreon-only feed and your name announced and free giveaways. You will also receive a handmade crochet bookmark by myself or Becky as an addition on top. And if you wish to go to our gold membership, you will be able to recommend to us different books that you would like to hear on the podcast, and those will be given priority. You will get priority given to any of your emails, and you will also get all of the previous awards. So the handmade crochet bookmark, the Patreon only feed, and the access to free giveaways, and probably an extra special shout out on the next podcast. But if you are unable to donate any money to the Mental Health Book Club podcast, that doesn't necessarily mean that there's nothing that you can do. You can continue to like and share the podcast with friends and family and talk about us. You could leave us a 5-star review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. All of that is extremely helpful to us, and we really do appreciate your help. So let's get stuck into some of the statistics surrounding autism and anxiety and how it impacts people in their everyday life. So the statistics are, in the UK, around 700,000 people are on the autistic spectrum, and together with their families, this means autism is a part of a daily life for 2.8 million people. Without understanding, autistic people and families are at risk of being isolated and developing mental health problems, such as anxiety and depression. Autism is much more common than many people think, because the 700,000 relates to 1 in 100 people being affected by autism. Autism doesn't just affect children. Autistic children grow up to be autistic adults, which I think some people do often forget. While autism is incurable, the right support at the right time can make an enormous difference to people's lives. Autism is often a hidden disability. You can't always tell if someone is autistic or not. 34% of children on the autism spectrum say that the worst thing about being at school is being picked on. So that's people not understanding the particular ways and behaviours. 63% of children on the autism spectrum are not in the kind of school their parents believe would best support them. 17% of autistic children have been suspended from school. 48% of those have been suspended 3 or more times, and 4% had been expelled from 1 or more schools. 70% of autistic adults say that they are not getting the help they need from social services. 70% of autistic adults also told the National Autistic Society that, with more support, they would feel less isolated. At least 1 in 3 autistic adults are experiencing severe mental health difficulties due to lack of support. Only 16% of autistic adults in the UK are in full-time paid employment, and only 32% are in some kind of paid work. Only 10% of autistic adults receive employment support, but 53% say they want it. So those are statistics for the UK. In comparison, in the USA, when compared to countries with top-performing kids, the United States is number 3 for the most autism diagnoses in the world. In comparison, the UK falls between the rates for Denmark and Canada with the 1 in 100. So if we were included on the list that I found, we would be number 7. And this information was taken from Focus for Health. And I will put a link in the show notes and also put this particular table in the blog post that I will create. But it's a list of 17 competing countries that outperform the US academically and who had recent autism data that this particular website could find. It's not a list of the whole world, and it doesn't include autism rates older than 2004, so this is actually pretty out of date now by 13 years, so that is quite an interesting thing to remember about this particular information. But we have Hong Kong, which has 1 in 27, South Korea, which is 1 in 38, USA 1 in 45, Japan 1 in 55, and that goes all the way down to Poland. It is 1 child in 3,333 that has a diagnosis of autism. So a little bit more background about autism. And although autism is listed in the Diagnostics and Statistics Manual for mental disorders, it's not generally viewed as a mental disorder itself. It's more viewed as a neurological disorder, or comes under the term pervasive development disorder. And this is also because autism spectrum conditions have a genetic component intermixed with the complex ways that we as human beings interact with our environment. So people are born with autism, but it's then how it's expressed outwardly that depends upon their individual's genes and the environment that they are brought into. So the term autistic spectrum disorder is what describes the commonalities in individuals' autistic behaviour, coupled with the emotional and or sensory differences that these particular group of people suffer from. People on the autism spectrum can have co-occurring mental health conditions, and as we saw with Emma Louise Bridge and her book Autism, Anxiety and Me, for her she has social anxiety disorder along with her autism. The mental health conditions are often treated with psychotropic medications such as SSRIs. Co-occurring mental health conditions can include, as we've already said, anxiety, but there's also issues with depression and hyperactivity. So the main problem that people on the autism spectrum face when they're trying to access appropriate and effective treatment for their co-occurring mental health issue is the fact that there is this issue with their autism as well. And you need to have the right clinician that has a sense of how there is the interplay between autism and the mental health condition itself. And you can't necessarily treat them as two separate things. The autism comes hand in hand with the mental health condition. The mental health condition is impacted by the autism. So whereas previously we've talked about a particular mental health condition being treated as just one condition, they have to be considered as co-occurring and linked together. So what some people may find is that as a result of the autism and the mental health condition, it's often difficult to identify which aspect is causing a particular issue that the person is presenting with. Is it actually the mental health condition? Is it the autism? Or is it a combination of the two? So the next part I want to discuss is the symptoms of autism before we get into the diagnosis part, which is the technical diagnosis from the DSM and the ICD-10. But in terms of symptoms of autism, I found 2 separate presentations. So that is signs of ASD in preschool children. And when I say ASD in this context, it's autistic spectrum disorder, and also autistic spectrum disorder symptoms and signs for school-age children. So there are some differences between the two and their presentations. So the signs in preschool children include issues with spoken language. The individual or the child who is under school age may show delayed speech development. So for example, speaking less than 50 different words by the age of 2, or not even speaking at all. Frequent repetition of set words and phrases. Speech that sounds very monotonous or flat, so there's no difference in the level that they're speaking at, and preferring to communicate using single words despite being able to speak in complete sentences. They have issues responding to others around them, so not responding to their name being called despite having normal hearing. And if that's anything like my parents, they would be like, that's just selective hearing. But in this case, this is a symptom of autism. Rejecting cuddles initiated by a parent or caregiver, although they may initiate cuddles themselves. Reacting unusually negatively when asked to do something by someone else. Also, interacting with others can be an issue, so they will show that they are not aware of other people's personal space, or being unusually intolerant of people entering their own personal space. They may show little interest in interacting with other people, including children of a similar age. They may also not enjoy situations that most children of their age like, such as birthday parties. They prefer to play alone rather than asking others to play with them, and they rarely use gestures or facial expressions when communicating, and they also avoid eye contact. And in terms of behaviour in the preschool child, they may show repetitive movements such as flapping their hands, rocking back and forth, or flicking their fingers. They may find that playing with toys in a repetitive and unimaginative way, such as lining blocks up in order of size or colour, rather than using them to build something. They may prefer to have familiar routine and get very upset if there are changes to that routine. They have a strong like or dislike of certain foods based on the texture or colour of the food as much as the taste. They also have unusual sensory interests. So, for example, children with autistic spectrum disorder may sniff toys, objects, or people inappropriately. So, in terms of the school-age child, the signs and symptoms of ASD in the school-age child is slightly different, but is also broken down into spoken language, responding to others, interacting with others, and behaviour. So, for the school-age child, the spoken language, the child may prefer to avoid using spoken language. Their speech may sound very monotonous or flat. They may speak in pre-learned phrases rather than putting together individual words to form new sentences, and seeming to talk at people rather than sharing a two-way conversation. So that's just kind of them giving you a lot of information, but them not really interacting with you when you talk to them. In terms of responding to others, this is taking people's speech literally and being unable to understand sarcasm, metaphors, or figures of speech. They may react unusually negatively when asked to do something by someone else. In terms of interacting with others, they may find it difficult to be aware of other people's personal space, or being unusually intolerant of people entering their own personal space, similar to that of the preschool child. They will show little interest in interacting with other people, including children of a similar age, or having few close friends despite attempts to form friendships, so there's that issue with social skills. Not understanding how people normally interact socially, such as greeting people or wishing them farewell. Being unable to adapt the tone and content of their speech to different social situations. So, for example, speaking very formally at a party and then speaking to total strangers in a familiar way. They may find that they don't enjoy situations and activities that most children of their age enjoy. And they may rarely use gestures or facial expressions when communicating. And again, they also will tend to avoid eye contact with others. In terms of behaviour, again, you will see the repetitive movements such as flapping their hands, rocking back and forth, or flicking their fingers, playing in a repetitive and unimaginative way, often preferring to play with objects rather than people, developing a highly specific interest in a particular subject or activity. So I know some children that have gone through their obsessions with dinosaurs and other things. However, also with this, remember that certain things may just be normal child development and the way that your child does things. They will prefer to have familiar routine and get very upset if there are changes to that routine. They will have a strong like or dislike of certain foods, again based on their texture, the colour of the food as much as the taste, and unusual sensory interests. So, for example, children with ASD, again sniffing toys, objects, or people inappropriately. So there are also other conditions associated with autism, and so people with autism often have symptoms or aspects of other conditions that include a learning disability, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or ADHD, Tourette syndrome or other tic disorders. There may be some issues with epilepsy, dyspraxia, obsessive compulsive disorder or OCD. There may be some issues with generalized anxiety disorder, depression, bipolar disorder. They may have issues with sleep, and they may have some sensory difficulties. So one thing that I didn't specifically talk about at the beginning with the statistics section is the impact of autism and gender. And there is some marked discrepancies between the genders, with boys more likely to be diagnosed with autism than girls. and the ratings across different studies show different numbers. So, for example, anecdotal evidence have come up with men and women ratios ranging from 2-1 to 16-1, and I believe Becky gave a statistic in the main podcast, and they're not actually 100% sure what the particular causes are. It may be the fact that girls and women present differently with autism than boys, and so they are underdiagnosed, and that high-functioning people who have autism are not getting the diagnosis that they require. It may be the fact that we socialise girls in a completely different way than we do boys, and that as a result of that different socialisation, they are able to mask the symptoms better than the male counterparts. But I've got some more statistics here that you might find interesting. A 2009 survey done by Burgess of adults living in households throughout England with autism found that 1.8% of men and boys surveyed had a diagnosis, in comparison to 0.2% of women and girls, which is quite a large disparity between the two. Hans Asperger thought no women or girls were affected by the syndrome that he described in Autistic Psychopathy in Childhood in 1944, although clinical evidence later caused him to revise this thinking. In Leo Kanner's 1943 study of a small group of children with autism, there were 4 times as many boys as there were girls. In their much larger 1993 study of Asperger Syndrome in mainstream schools in Sweden, Ehrhals and Gilberg found the same boy-to-girl ratio of 4-1, so 4 boys to every 1 girl. In 2015, the ratio of men to women who use the National Autistic Society's services was approximately 3 men to 1 woman, and in those that use the National Autistic Society schools is approximately 5 boys to 1 girl. Lorna Wing found in her paper on sex ratios in early childhood autism that among people with high-functioning autism or Asperger syndrome, there were as many as 15 times more men and boys as there were women and girls, while in people with learning difficulties, as well as autism, the ratio of men and boys to women and girls was closer to 2-1. And as I said before, this could just be because that while women and girls are less likely to develop autism, when they do, they are more severely impaired. Or alternatively, it could suggest high-functioning women and girls with autism have been underdiagnosed compared to men and boys. Women and girls with Asperger syndrome may be better at masking their difficulties, like I said, in order to fit in with their peers and have a more even profile of social skills in general. So next I thought it would be interesting just to go into a little bit about how women and girls present with autism in comparison to boys. So Gould and Ashton Smith in 2011 identified the different way in which girls and women present under the following headings. They had social understanding, social communication, social imagination, which is highly associated with routines, rituals and special interests, thus resulting in the need for different ways to identify women and girls that are impacted by autism. Unfortunately, I was unable to access the full journal paper, and so I can only really tell you what it says in the abstract. So that was what the abstract said, that they have identified how some diagnostic questions may be altered to identify some females on the autism spectrum who might otherwise have been missed as a result of this research. As I mentioned before, that girls may be able to mask their symptoms of autism, where they are able to follow social actions by delayed imitation because they observe other children and copy them, resulting in the masking of symptoms, and this comes from Tony Atwood in 2007. They might also find that interacting socially happens more often with girls because they are more aware of and feel a need to interact socially. They are involved in social play but are often led by their peers rather than initiating the social contact. And girls are generally more socially inclined, and many have one special friend, so that will also mask the symptoms of autism. They also are subject to greater social expectations, so in society girls are expected to be social in their communication. Girls on the spectrum do not do social chit-chat or make meaningless comments in order to facilitate social communication, and the idea of social hierarchy and how one communicates with people of different statuses can be problematic, and that gets girls into trouble with teachers because they don't necessarily recognise that they have authority over them. Girls tend to have more of an active imagination and engage in pretend play more often, And so evidence suggests that girls have more active imaginations and more pretend play. And this was identified by Nick Meyer, Wheelwright, and Baron Cohen in 2008. And many have a very rich and elaborate fantasy world with imaginary friends. Girls escape into fiction and some live in another world with, for example, fairies and witches. Girls also have interests which are similar to other girls. So the interests of girls in the spectrum are very often similar to those of other girls around them, such as animals, horses, classical literature, and so on. And therefore they're not seen as unusual. It is not the special interests that differentiate them from their peers, but it's the quality and intensity of those interests. So they get so hyper-focused on that particular aspect that is where the differences occur. And many obsessively watch soap operas and have an intense interest in celebrities. The presence of repetitive behaviour and special interests is part of the diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder, and that, as I said, is different from what you may see from boys, and this is a crucial area in which the male stereotype of autism has clouded the issue in diagnosing women and girls. Okay, so the next bit is really about the diagnosis of autism and how the medical profession will diagnose autism. So you have to be diagnosed by a practitioner, a GP, someone who has knowledge. You can't just self-diagnose or have someone go, I think you have autism, and then not go and get the diagnosis. Purely because as a result of you getting the diagnosis, it means you then have access to additional support that will help you. And whilst I did say in the last podcast that I believe that my husband is on the autism spectrum somewhere because of some of the traits that he exhibits, there is no formal diagnosis, and I can't just say, yes, I think he's got autism. I just think he is somewhere on that spectrum because of the things that he does. So the diagnostic criteria for autism comes from the DSM-5 and the ICD-10, which is the international classifications, which is mainly used within the USA, and they tend to then place people into different categories based on the symptoms that are present at the time of them being assessed. And these categories are continuing to develop and will change over time. So one of the most recent changes is the fact that the DSM-5 no longer has Asperger Syndrome as a particular diagnosis. It is now all kind of covered under autistic spectrum disorder. And I think I made the comment when we were talking about autism, anxiety and me about the fact that they had dropped the Asperger's diagnosis and what that actually meant. And I think Becky said that just because they have dropped the particular term doesn't mean that people will stop using it. And I did some additional digging to find out if that was the case and what happens to those that have been given a diagnosis of Asperger syndrome since the criteria has now changed, is that people that have been given that diagnosis don't necessarily have to drop the name and the classification that they have been given. So the criteria for autism spectrum disorder is split into several parts. There is part A, B, C, D, and E. So let's start with A. And so if there is a persistent deficit in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, as manifested by the following currently or by history. So 1, deficits in social emotional reciprocity. So that's the practice of exchanging things with others for mutual benefit, ranging from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation to reduced sharing of interests, emotion or affect, to failure to initiate or respond to social interactions. 2, deficits in non-verbal communicative behaviours used for social interaction, ranging from poorly integrated verbal and non-verbal communication, abnormalities in eye contact and body language, or deficits in understanding and use of gestures, to a total lack of facial expressions and non-verbal communication. And 3, deficits in developing, maintaining and understanding relationships, ranging from difficulties adjusting behaviour to suit various social contexts, to difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends, to absence of interest in peers. And the severity of what I am talking about is categorised into 3 separate issues. So there's level 1 requiring support, level 2 requiring substantial support, and level 3 requiring very substantial support, which I'll go into a bit more detail in a moment. And then B, restricted repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests or activities as manifested by at least 2 of the following. And this can be at the time of the assessment or by historical examples. So they need to show 2 of these. 1, stereotyped or repetitive motor movement, use of objects or speech, e.g. simple motor stereotypies, which are rhythmic, repetitive, focused, fixed, predictable, purposeful movements that really don't have any purpose that occur in a child. Lining up of toys or flipping objects, echolalia, which is the meaningless repetition of another person's spoken words, idiosyncratic phrases, such as language that has a private meaning or a meaning that only makes sense to those familiar with the situation where the phrase originated from. 2, insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines or ritualised patterns or verbal, non-verbal behaviour. So, for example, extreme distress at small changes, difficulties with transitions, rigid thinking patterns, greeting rituals, and need to take same route, which we see with Emma and her sister when they try and take a walk together, and how they have their own separate spots for crossing the road. 3, highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, so strong attachment or preoccupation with unusual objects. And 4, hyper or hypo-reactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So, for example, the apparent indifference to pain, temperature, adverse response to specific sounds or textures, excessive smelling or touching of objects, visual fascination with lights or movement. Again, in this particular criteria, the clinician is asked to specify the severity of those particular traits that the person is exhibiting, and that's going back to the level 1, level 2, level 3, so the requiring support, requiring substantial support, and requiring very substantial support. C, symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, but may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacity, or may be masked by learned strategies in later life. D, symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. And E, these disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability, so that's intellectual development disorder or global development delay. Intellectual disability and autism spectrum disorder frequently co-occur to make comorbid diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability. Social communication should be below that expected for the general development. Individuals with a well-established DSM-4 diagnosis of autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, or pervasive development disorder not otherwise specified should be given the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. Individuals who have marked deficits in social communication but whose symptoms do not otherwise meet criteria for autism spectrum disorder should be evaluated for social communication disorder. So that's the alternative diagnosis for someone who doesn't meet the criteria for autism spectrum disorder but still has certain characteristics and behavioural issues that have impacted their communication. With all of this, the clinician is asked to specify whether the particular person presents with or without accompanying intellectual impairment, whether they present with or without accompanying language impairment associated with a known medical or genetic condition or environmental factor, or catatonia, which is a complex neuropsychological disorder which refers to a cluster of abnormalities in movement, volition, speech, and behaviour. So when I was discussing the first part of the diagnostic criteria, I talked about the levels of severity associated with the presenting criteria that a medical professional will look for. And so I'd just like to go back through what level 1, level 2 and level 3 actually means. So for level 1, which is requiring support, what this is suggesting is that without support in place, deficits in social communication can cause noticeable impairments. Difficulty initiating social interactions and clear examples of atypical or unsuccessful response to social overtures of others. May appear to have decreased interest in social interaction, so for example, a person who is able to speak in full sentences and engages in communication, but whose to and fro conversation with others fail, and whose attempts to make friends are odd and typically unsuccessful. In terms of restricted and repetitive behaviour, for level 1, they will show inflexibility of behaviour, causes significant interference with functioning in one or more contexts. There will be difficulty switching between activities. There will be problems of organisation and planning that hamper the individual's independence. In terms of level 2, which is classified as requiring substantial support, what you'll see in social communication is marked deficits in verbal and non-verbal social communication skills, social impairments apparent even with supports in place. There'll be limited initiation of social interactions and reduced or abnormal responses to social overtures from others. So, for example, a person who speaks simple sentences, whose interaction is limited to narrow special interests, and has markedly odd non-verbal communication. In terms of restrictive repetitive behaviours, a person that is requiring substantial support will show inflexibility of behaviour, difficulty coping with change, or other restricted repetitive behaviours appear frequently enough to be obvious to the casual observer, and that interferes with the functioning in a variety of contexts, and distress and or difficulty changing focus or action. And finally, level 3, which is requiring very substantial support. In terms of social communications, you'll see severe deficits in verbal and non-verbal social communication skills, causing severe impairments in functioning, very limited initiation of social interactions and minimal response to social overtures from others. So, for example, a person with few words of intelligible speech who rarely initiates interaction, and when he or she does, they make unusual approaches to meet their needs only and respond to only very direct social approaches. And in terms of restrictive repetitive behaviours, there is an inflexibility of behaviour, extreme difficulty coping with change or other restrictive repetitive behaviours that markedly interfere with functioning in all spheres. There is great distress and difficulty changing focus or action. So those are the classifications of the 3 levels of severity. Now, I do have the diagnostic criteria here for social pragmatic communication disorder. So if you are not diagnosed with autism, this would be the next diagnosis if you show some of the things that we have discussed. I'm not going to go through it now. I should put it on the blog post so you can look at it if you so wish. In terms of the ICD-10, which is the classification system that is really used in America, particularly for noting down a particular diagnosis for insurance company purposes. And in 2015, autism and Asperger syndrome are still considered separate coding criteria, unlike the DSM-5. However, there is a reviewed version, which is the ICD-11, which should be coming out later in 2018, and it brings it back in line with the DSM-5. However, I thought it would be interesting and important to include what they consider to be autism and Asperger syndrome. So the ICD-10 presents a number of possible autism profiles, such as childhood autism, atypical autism, and Asperger syndrome. These profiles are included under the pervasive development disorders heading within the ICD-10, and that is defined as a group of disorders characterized by qualitative abnormalities in reciprocal social interactions and in patterns of communication, and by restricted, stereotype, repetitive repertoire of interests and activities. These qualitative abnormalities are a pervasive feature of the individual's functioning in all situations. So people with Asperger syndrome are of average or above average intelligence. They do not usually have the learning disability that many autistic people have, but they may have specific learning difficulties. They have fewer problems with speech, but may still have difficulties with understanding and processing language. So there are 4 different criteria for the diagnosis of Asperger syndrome. And so that's A, B, C, and D. So A, a lack of any clinically significant general delay in spoken or receptive language or cognitive development. Diagnosis requires that single words should have developed by 2 years of age or earlier, and that communicative phrases be used by 3 years of age or earlier. Self-help skills, adaptive behaviour, and curiosity about the environment during the first 3 years should be at a level consistent with intellectual development. However, motor milestones may be somewhat delayed, and motor clumsiness is usual, although not a necessary diagnostic feature. Isolated special skills often related to abnormal preoccupations are common but not required. B. Qualitative abnormalities in reciprocal social interactions, the criteria as for autism. C. An unusually intense circumscribed interest or restrictive, repetitive, and stereotyped patterns of behaviour, interests and activities, criteria as for autism. However, it would be less usual for those to include either motor mannerisms, preoccupations with part objects or non-functional elements of play material. And D. the disorder is not attributable to other varieties of pervasive development disorder, schizotypal disorder, simple schizophrenia, reactive and disinhibited attachment disorder of childhood, obsessional personality disorder, or obsessive compulsive disorder. So that's quite a bit of a mouthful there with all of those different diagnoses. For many people, the term Asperger Syndrome is part of their day-to-day vocabulary and identity, so it is understandable that there are concerns around the removal from the DSM-5 of Asperger Syndrome. And as I said before, anyone who has a diagnosis of Asperger Syndrome retains that diagnosis. Research has found that using the appropriate techniques and the new DSM-5 criteria correctly can identify people who should receive a diagnosis of autistic spectrum disorder across age and ability. So that brings us really to the end part of this podcast, which is really going to look at the interplay between autism and anxiety. So there are certain things that a person with autism will suffer from that will impact the levels of anxiety that they feel. So for example, autistic traits can have an impact upon a level of anxiety experienced by the individual. So certain autistic traits, such as perfectionism, preference for structure and routine, and repetitive behaviours, can have an impact upon what levels of anxiety an individual feels. And people with autism like to imagine outcomes to situations that they may find themselves in, which we can all probably understand because we probably do the same from time to time. But the idea for them is to make the new experiences not so daunting, but as a result of them thinking about it, that can lead to catastrophizing. So that is them imagining the worst case scenario in relation to how a non-autistic person will respond to them, how they will then create in their minds a very unlikely negative future around the misunderstanding of others' motivations. And so this can be combated with doing something called a Swot Analysis. So that is looking at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats in a particular situation. And that will allow the person with autism to view the entire situation rather than getting very focused on one particular aspect. And also practicing mindfulness. So that's putting the brakes on, slowing everything down and getting them to really focus on the entire picture. There are also issues with certain thinking styles associated with people who have autism, and that impacts the anxiety levels. So, for example, there are generally 3 specific thinking styles associated with autism, and those are rigid thinking styles, logical thinking styles, and hyper-focused or fixated thinking styles. And all of these will have an impact upon the level of anxiety. So, for example, with logical thinking, this is really quite helpful, really, when a decision is made because it's a very practical, logical parameters are set. And then as a result of that, a decision is then made. And there's generally a lack of emotional input from the person with autism. And so saying the person has no emotions when they make decisions is not necessarily correct. It's just that within the decision-making process, those emotions are really put to the back of their mind. But as this provides an individual with the feeling of control, and that allows them to feel that they have order over their situation, there is issues when things such as misunderstandings occur. So with autism, anxiety and me, we see the difficulties that Emma has in understanding the fact that she thinks the hangers should be one way, but the boss at the charity shop believes they should be the other way round. And although she goes ahead and goes, okay, I will just change it back, she still doesn't really understand why the person hasn't got this logical thought and saying this is the way the hangers should go. There is also rigid thinking, so that's black and white thinking, and again this provides the individual with a feeling of sense of control and order to the environment that they're in, but issues occur as people cannot see all the possible outcomes of a situation, and they may then focus on the worst, so this is them catastrophizing the situation. This can lead to worries and anxieties that people dislike them, even if there's limited evidence that suggests that. They have judgments about things, people and situations, and they do this so quickly that before they fully understand everything, they get a snapshot, and so they don't see the full picture. So for example, with Emma, she has very much rigid thinking about how she's having her food, and it has to be in twos. And although you can see that there are coping mechanisms that they've been able to come up with, the whole, if I smush the beans a bit, then it's okay because it doesn't have to be in twos. But in certain people that could cause a meltdown. There's also this hyper-focused and fixated thinking, which is classified as a broken record, and this occasionally leads to clarity and insight into others' situations, but can also cause sleeping difficulties because this hyper-focused, fixated thinking will result in the rumination of those situations that then ultimately increases anxiety because of this negative focus. And so the material for the blind that we see in the book, that she becomes very fixated on the fact that she wants the Wallace and Gromit fabric. The problem being that it's not big enough, it's not going to do what she needs it to do. But again, they're able to come up with this compromise that again may, for some other people with autism, cause a meltdown. People with autism generally struggle with change, and so that can also increase the levels of anxiety a person feels. So with change, people with autism will often have a set routine, and that particular set routine will help them feel in control. But if there is a change, that can then cause high levels of anxiety. Past treatment for children with autism has been that instead of putting them in a situation where change is inevitable and is constant, the parents have been told what you need to do is ensure that there's this nice, strict, rigid routine that you stick to every day, and that will help your child to feel safe and in control. However, the world isn't like that, and it's the fact that the world is unpredictable, change is inevitable and often unavoidable, and that then will cause a major issue as the child reaches adulthood if there's been this rigid routine and now things have changed. So what they think now, or have suggested now, that the whole idea is to help the individual develop coping mechanisms and strategies that will help them to develop resilience when dealing with any change situation. It was also shown that some individuals who were brought up in a completely different household where change was constant, so for example someone constant moving home and that routine not necessarily being there, meant that in themselves, when something like that would happen, they just saw that as normal, and that was what the world was like. The world was going to change. So for an individual with autism who is trying to cope with change, if they lack the coping mechanisms, then it is suggested that you start by identifying small changes that can be planned and that the individual can take control of those, and then they can see the change as manageable. And this is called self-integrated change. So the more you do and implement different changes, you see the consequences of those changes are not necessarily that bad when you can control them and you can manage them. It means that you feel that you are able to manage them better. Other coping mechanisms could be a pros and cons list, but that is often only useful when there is a decision to be made, and if it's an unavoidable change, then a pros and cons list isn't necessarily going to be that useful to the individual. You can also try the Swot Analysis, and that can help you to reframe the way that you see a particular situation, moving away from the negatives and into a more positive light. You can also think about keeping an anxiety journal, which allows you to identify any triggering events that can cause you to feel anxiety. So the journal could have the date, time, what happened, how you felt, what was happening before you started to feel anxious, and possible triggers. You may need to consider seeking psychotherapy and counselling. So you may need the additional help to deal with the anxiety and the autism. And so a professional can help you to role play through situations and see them in different and new ways. You might find that speaking to trusted friends and family to get their opinion about situations, and that they can help you by challenging your paranoia and the way that you're catastrophizing the situation. So in Emma's case, you generally see that from her mum Penelope. There are also sensory sensitivities that an individual with autism can have that can impact their levels of anxiety. So for example, sensory inputs are affected by several things such as physical well-being, mental well-being, tiredness, hunger and thirst, combinations of sensory inputs, temperature, air pressure, task demands, communication demands, and mental associations and memories associated with a particular task. So sensory aversions can increase the levels of anxiety for both the individual with autism and those that are around them. And I don't know about you, but some people will find that as a result of others around you feeling anxious, you then start to feel more anxious yourself. And because the people around you are concerned that you're going to have a meltdown, you then start to pick up on that anxiety. and then you try to avoid all of those kinds of situations. And so therefore everyone needs to have a plan of action in certain situations that you can all agree on to reduce everyone's anxiety. So for example, if a particular smell causes an issue, then you need to come up with an idea and a plan of action of how to combat that when it occurs. People with autism also tend to have communication issues, and these is a common issue associated with a person with autism and will increase their issues with fear and rejection, worry and anxiety. And so people won't necessarily be as understanding as they could be about a situation, particularly if the person with autism comes into contact with someone who doesn't necessarily know that they have autism. And so those people may respond unkindly, they may be very nasty, and they may also hurt the individual with autism. There's also issues that the person with autism has anxiety because they're worried that they're going to hurt others by the things that they say and do, which is definitely a cause for concern. And so as a result of these anxieties, they're concerned that they may say something stupid and then not necessarily know that they've said something stupid, and that people will laugh at them. And an individual with autism has a less well-developed set of social skills as a symptom, but certain social skills can be learnt. So for example, when to say please and thank you, those are really in some ways prescribed by social interactions. And so there are some ways to deal with this anxiety. So you can ask a trusted friend or family member their opinion after a particular situation, or you can role play like Emma did before she made certain phone calls, and also ask about similar situations and what someone else would do in a particular situation. It's also important to note that there are people out there that are just plain mean and unkind, and it's okay to avoid those types of people. It can become more complicated if that individual is someone who has some kind of authority over you, such as a boss or a supervisor. There is things that you can do, so you can go above and speak to your boss's boss if it is someone within the workplace. Also, there is the potential for you to change jobs and look for a new job. You can also practice communication by attending groups that have similar interests to you, so that it makes it easier for you to discuss things and initiate conversations. And there are also social groups out there for people that suffer with autism, and so that you're in a safe environment where you can practice these things and don't have to fear the fact that someone is going to laugh at you or be mean to you. I do have a list of what it does mean to have social anxiety disorder. And again, I'm not going to put this in this podcast, but I will put it within the blog post. And so again, you can have a look at it if you want to. And as a result of the anxiety, another thing that you may find that you need is additional help through therapy and through medications. So in terms of therapy, there are several different therapeutic methods that can be employed to help you and have been shown to actually benefit someone with autism facing their anxiety. So there's CBT, which we've talked about before, which is cognitive behaviour therapy. And so people become aware of how they're thinking, and those thinking patterns are then challenged, and those patterns are then changed. There's also solution-focused therapy, and this is a more focused therapy that it's more focused on what the client wants to achieve rather than their thinking patterns, and it focuses on the present and future and not the past. And the idea of this therapy is to develop solutions and problem solve. There's also Schema Therapy, and this is a particular therapy I'm very familiar with because I do Schema Therapy, and it has been shown that there are 5 domains split into 18 schemas, and those are your core beliefs, and you develop your core beliefs as you are growing up. And what happens is that a guy called Nick Dobin has boiled down those 5 issues, or those 5 domains, into phrases that will show you how it impacts a person with autism and anxiety. And so number 1 is that people with autism will find that they think that people cannot be trusted. Number 2, that they feel that they can't function adequately in the world. Number 3, things are either good or bad. Number 4, they feel that they're inherently worthless, or that they have no worth other than when another person gives them approval. And number 5, the world is an unpredictable and unsafe place to be. And finally, in terms of therapy, there's acceptance and commitment therapy. And with that, the individual accepts that difficulties exist in everyday life, and that they then develop skills to deal with the painful and negative thoughts that they have less impact upon their life. So that was our episode on autism and anxiety. Thanks so much for joining us and listening to us talk about different mental health topics. I will put together a blog post with all of the information that I collected for this particular podcast, along with all of the references so that you can go back and have a look at it later. And next week I will be joined with Becky and we will be discussing A Bitter Pill to Swallow. Until next time, bye for now. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Mental Health Book Club podcast. If you feel that you need additional support with your mental health, please call the Samaritans on 116 123, which is a 24-hour helpline. And if you need additional information about mental health issues, please visit Mind at mind.org.uk. Our next podcast will be about A Bitter Pill to Swallow by Tiffany Golar. To find out more, please visit our website, mentalhealthbookclub.com. We would really love to hear what you think about this podcast. Please get in touch with us at our Facebook page, which is the Mental Health Book Club, or at our Twitter, which is at MHBC_podcast. And if you like the podcast, please share it with your family and friends and leave us a 5-star rating on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts.